fascinated by internet horror stories and creepypastas. I was young and impressionable when I stumbled across my first video game mod that went eerily wrong. That tumbled me down a dark and narrow rabbit hole into the Russian sleep experiment, then further lost me in cryptic wonderland where all those other internet classics live. No matter how unsettling the story, I really wanted to believe it. At first, I wanted every single detail to be true. Later, I came to most relish the tales that seemed to contain one or two real ingredients, liberally seasoned to please the palates of the audience. And there was a growing envy that rode along the fascination. I wanted to wield the spices, to be just those infamous writers. I wanted to create a viral sensation that would sweep across the internet and make people's spines tingle and burn with genuine, inescapable fear. The kind that really makes you feel alive. But first, I needed to find the raw, true heart for my recipe. I began to pore over old newspaper articles, looking for weird things in my area. I sifted through mountains of garbage online, looking for a tasty kernel of truth hidden within the bland layers of unappetizing urban myths. But inspiration eluded me, and I started to lose interest. As adulthood took hold, it slowly became to strangle my childish ability to believe there was some wild truth running around out there, despite never finding any footprints. I was almost ready to admit that perhaps the world was far more mundane and uninteresting than I had ever imagined, and that every one of my treasured stories were in fact just marvelous fictions, all pretty frosting and no cake. Then, like a horrible gift dropped right into my lap, I chanced to overhear two nurses at the local hospital talking in hushed whispers about the mystery of Suicide Orphan. How could I not do everything in my power to find out more? I'll spare you all the dusty details about how I came by the information I have. Most of it was uncovered by boring hard work, ordinary journalism, and archive deviling. And I'm not proud when that fails. I've found that there's very little information you can't dig up if you use some natural and enhanced advantages. In my case, honey blonde hair, a splash of bright lipstick, and a short skirt. The real story begins in 1970s, when a young couple, Danny and Susan Johnson, prematurely birthed their second child. They named her Catherine. The baby grew quickly, and is soon healthy enough to come home, where she was dotted on her elder sister and parents. She was bright and happy, apparently escaping any disadvantage of her prematurity. She began to speak at 18 months, and started to read by the age of 4. The first tragedy struck the family when Catherine was in kindergarten. The elder sister, Sarah, was found hanging in her wardrobe, a pink plastic skipping rope looped around her neck. Emergency services were called, but the 9-year-old girl was not able to be resuscitated. As you would expect, the family was devastated. The cooperation with the police and the coroner and endured a protracted and grueling investigation into every aspect of their lives. No evidence of foul play was ever uncovered, and the ruling of Sarah's death was left inconclusive. Either it was accidental or a rare child suicide. Everything slid rapidly and predictably downhill for the Johnsons from there, with the mother falling into black depression frighteningly fast, and the father drowning in his own pain in a bottle. The date on the second ambulance report is barely 6 months after the first on the invoice of Sarah's headstone. Susan Johnson was found in the family garage, her asphyxiated corpse as pink as a child's skipping rope, a side effect of carbon monoxide inhalation. The car was still idling, with the hose from the exhaust pipe pushed through the crack in the window. The grim trifecta of paperwork is complete 2 months later, when Danny Johnson successfully hung himself in the very same garage. A sawhorse kicked out from underneath him, and his wife perfume heavy in the air. With no other living relatives able to be traced, Katherine Johnson became a suicide orphan. The Waldens were a first foster family. They were experienced in caring for children from difficult circumstances, loved her to pieces, and did everything they could to heal the poor girl. Only 5, she barely understood what had happened and why, so she adapted quickly. I found one of her first school reports, buried amongst random papers in a forgotten box beneath the Walders' house. It paints a bright picture of an especially courageous child, a little girl who made friends easily and was radiant in her happiness. All seemed to be going very well for Katherine and her new parents. She's all dimpled smiles in the photographs of her cuddling the kitten she received for her 7th birthday. And certificates and trophies suggest that she was something of an athlete prodigy, outrunning every other girl in her district. There was not a single warning sign that anything was wrong with Jenny Walder, the foster mother. According to the archived reports, she had appeared completely normal, right up to the day she was found in her bathtub. The life seeped out of her into deep crimson water. There was no hesitation mark surrounding the long, definite cuts in her wrists from where she had opened her veins. The foster father, Michael Walders, survived his wife for another 9 months before he succumbed to a catatonic depression and was taken to a mental health facility. He didn't move nor speak for the next 6 weeks, so none of the staff appeared to be sure of how he got onto the roof. The leap from the 5th floor shattered his skull into 9 separate fragments, and his life ended into a concrete parking lot. Katherine was left utterly alone for the 2nd time in her short life. She was put into state care, while another family was sought to take care of her. Now, this is the point where the rumors really start. The pool of prospect foster families was much smaller 30-odd years ago, and it was becoming difficult to keep her history from the community. People back then were superstitious enough to be very leery of a child with so much death in her past. Families long noted as being eager for a child, any child, abruptly changed their tune when it is revealed that the child being considered is Katherine, the suicide orphan. People beginning to speculate, very quietly, that Katherine herself was to blame for the 5 deaths. I like to think that there were others who shushed them and told them not to be so crude and cruel. A pair of childless atheists, Melissa and Tony Lipsey, finally accepted the girl into their care and instantly fell in love with her. Melissa was an aspiring writer who kept long, detailed journals of her life and experiences. After some convincing, her family let me read a few of the ones concerning Katherine. Their existence seemed idyllic, with no great calamities affecting them. Only the very ordinary hardships of family life. Psychological support was provided for the couple and the child from the day Katherine entered their home, and appears to have been quite careful and thorough for the time, right up until the point of her suicide. Melissa's diary spoke of love and hope and great plans for their new daughter when she grew up. Indeed, Katherine was excelling in every aspect of school life, and even been moved up a year. The final entry in the notebook is uncharacteristically short and contains one curious sentence about feeling empty, for no reason that anyone could fathom. On that date, Melissa and Tony Lipsey drove their car to the river, then walked into the water, fully clothed and hand in hand, and drowned together. It was ruled as an accident, but anyone who knew about Katherine knew that was a lie. Nobody wanted to adopt her after that. 10 years ago, she languished in a state orphanage, other children coming and going. She seemed to have made the best of it. Her tattered, photocopied file repeats the same phrases as reports from her early life. She was a child who smiled easily and often. She was loved by other children, and she never caused any trouble. She educated herself, borrowing great piles of books from the local library, clearly reading well beyond her age, and engaged the facility staff in thoughtful and philosophical conversations about her plight. Anyone close to her appeared to like her, yet, heartbreakingly, she seemed to understand exactly why nobody wanted her. The first staff suicide, that of Catherine's primary caregiver, sparked a panic, and half of the orphanage workers refused to come to work the following day. Children were quickly shifted into other facilities into nearby cities, and the place was temporarily shut down. Catherine knew precisely what was going on, and asked several times to just be let go. She said she didn't want any trouble anymore, that she would find a place in the woods and live on her own. She was interviewed and re-interviewed by law enforcement and by psychiatrists from her temporary solitude room and juvenile holding facility, until no one had any questions left to ask. The conclusion was rational and completely sensible. It was not this child, but the mythos following this child that was the cause of the suicides. Catherine should have been provided with a new identity and placed anonymously in another home on the other side of the country, and then the suicides would stop. Unfortunately, this conclusion was also completely wrong. Tracking Catherine became difficult at this point. I eventually managed to find her again with a fellow student. Her school teacher and her now foster parents all killed themselves within a few months of each other. She was 14 and must have been very aware of what that meant. When she was taken into custody, she fought like a demon and required 2 male police officers to restrain her. There's a curious note in the police report stating that those officers received injuries, but Catherine's later medical examination showed no injury at all to herself, not even a bruise. She was placed into inpatient psychiatric care. The breezy, bright child with the easy smile does not appear any more of the reports I was able to obtain. She was gone. The teenage Catherine is clearly deeply disturbed, and any trace of her personality was probably medicated away. The range of the psychotic drugs they managed to dose her with is extensive. Initial attempts to administer heavy-duty sedatives by injection are simply recorded as unsuccessful, and followed by a recommendation for oral medication only. But pills must have been enough, with the suicide orphan, locked away in a psych ward and a chemical straitjacket. Anyone would assume that was an end to the break trail of death that Catherine Johnson left wherever she went. And with the high turnover of overworked staff, there wasn't much risk of anyone getting attached to the young woman. Some of the inmates in her facility were found hanged or dead from self-mutilation. Well, it was a place for crazy people. That sort of stuff happened all the time. Normal connections appear to have been made. But on August 3rd, 1991, 2 staff members deliberately overdosed on patient medications, and several inmates escaped using the keys to the deceased. Amongst those that escaped was Catherine Johnson. She was smart once the drugs left her system, much smarter than the others, who were all caught in a matter of days. I think Catherine probably cut and dyed her hair and hitchhiked as far as she could get, as there were no sightings of her despite bulletins and flyers. The trail of documents was cold for a long time, and I expanded my search wider and wider, hoping to find the lost thread of her existence. And I had one grimly card up my sleeve. Even someone as smart and resourceful as she was couldn't do anything about the one thing that made her trackable. Everywhere she went, people killed themselves. Unfortunately, suicide is more common than you might first think, so the background noise is extensive. People kill themselves every other day, and for all kinds of reasons. A seemingly happy father of 3 will take a shotgun into the shower and blow his brains out, even though he was recently promoted at work, and his life seemed perfect. After reading far too many of those stories, I did eventually find her carry on footsteps. leading out west, a neat line of unexplained suicides which pointed to the forest mountain wilderness. The common factor that drew my attention was that each of the deceased owned some sort of supply or convenience shop. I contacted the library near Catherine's teenage orphanage, posing as a family member to access her library records. My suspicions were confirmed. Since she was 10 years old, she'd been researching outdoor survival and how to live self-sufficiently in the wilderness. I'm not much of an outdoors person, but the heady prospect of finding the mythical suicide orphan was too much for me. I probably overstocked on supplies and safety gear, but I didn't want to be caught short in poor weather. With an expensive GPS machine and enough food for a month, I started searching the mountains for Catherine Johnson. I suspected I was on the right track when I started finding increasing numbers of dead animals. Although that's not unusual in the wilderness, the corpses became very regular, almost intact, and quite fresh. Birds had seemingly fallen from the sky mid-flight, as though their tiny hearts had simply given up. Further on, dead rats and larger mammals marked a sort of grisly perimeter around Catherine's isolated bolt hole. The first sign was terrible and stark, a white board nailed to a tree and splashed with faded red paint. "Stay away or else," it read, like a warning on a children's treehouse. There were more signs as I pushed through the scrub, bearing similar implications. Each of them threatened some kind of violence, without being specific. Eventually I saw a crude hut through the trees, and painted on the door, in the same naive hand, were the words, "Come inside and you will die." I knew what was going on here. Catherine blamed herself for the deaths of everyone around her. She had done so since she was young, and she didn't want it happening again. By isolating herself in the wilderness, she believed that she could avoid bringing any more death to other people. And if she didn't have anyone who cared for her, then she couldn't lose anyone she cared about. I walked in Catherine's appallingly sad footsteps for so long. And at this point, I really did care about her. And I was no longer thinking about what that meant. Perhaps having spent my whole life looking for that kernel of truth, when I found it, I didn't want to believe it. "I'm coming in," I declared loudly as I pushed open the door. She sat by the stone fireplace, a small figure lost in the chair, made of carefully woven branches. Dark hair was piled up on top of her head, tied in place with a frayed scarf. Inside, the hut was tidy and clean, meticulous care evident in the orderliness of piles of spit logs and fur-covered furniture. She seemed to know immediately that I wasn't there by accident, that I was not some sort of lost hiker or hunter who had stumbled into her hideaway, despite the warning trail of animal corpses and signs. "I should have moved," she said without preamble, turning her gaze towards me. Her face was too youngful. She looked like a 20-year-old. I should have stuck to my plan and moved to another place in the wilds, to stop people like you from finding me. "Well, I'm glad I did find you," I replied meekly, unable to stop staring at her. I felt strangely uneasy at how young she looked. She was almost twice my age, yet somehow it felt quite the reverse. "You won't be," she said simply, with a small and solemn shake of her head. There was a tense, pregnant pause. Then she glanced at the iron kettle hung over the fireplace. "Would you like some tea? It's mostly mountain herbs, but it's hot." Not knowing what else to say, I simply nodded. The tiny hut should have been cozy, yet I was cold. "Tell me how you found me." And so I told her the same tale I'm telling you now. I laid out all the clever discoveries from end to end as she poured tea into a fire clay cup. the sharp scents of mint and pine suffering the air. She was silent while the account unfolded, but would sometimes nod, confirming a snippet of information when I sounded uncertain. In other revelations, she bowed her head and averted her eyes as though ashamed, but she never interrupted. When I was empty of words, she finally spoke. So, you wanted fame. That's why you sought me out. You wanted to tell my story to the world and become a sort of television celebrity. Her voice was layered with heavy and undisguised content, and I felt the color rise in my cheeks. I guess so, I mumbled. My stomach twisted, hollow despite the tea. Well, now you have your story. You found your suicide orphan, and everything about her is true. Wherever I go, death follows. It was my turn to be silent for a long moment. What could I say to that? But I needed to ask. I needed to be sure about one more thing. I have a question, I said finally, my voice dull in my ears. She shifted in her chair, placing one hand on the rough-hewn table. You want to know why I never killed myself? She stated flatly. Yes. A knife hung from her belt in a leather sheath. In a precise movement, she pulled it free, stabbing it cleanly through the hand resting on the rough wood between us. I shrieked in alarm and reflexively jerked back, the wicker chair nearly tipping me onto the floor. As quickly as she had drawn the blade, she yanked it free, leaving a deep cut that glimmered white tendon, then wielded dark with blood. She raised her wounded hand in the air, and I watched, disbelieving, as a vicious rent in her flesh knitted immediately, like some kind of claymation. It left not even a whisper of a scar betraying where it had been. Poison doesn't work either, she said, calmly wiping the knife clean on her sleeve. Even deadly nightshade only gives me a tummy ache. I tried a pistol once, but the bullet bounced right off my skull and made a mess of my crockery. The knife was rehomed in a scabbard, and she gave me a wan smile. I'd bury myself alive, but I'm too afraid of spending an eternity screaming into a lifeless dirt. Another long silence followed as we sipped our cooling tea. I drank my cup and stared at the dregs of gray leaves. They're green and all boiled away. I'm going to die, aren't I asked. It wasn't really a question. Of course you are. What other possible outcome do you think there could be? Did you really think that just because you were the one to find me, you'd somehow be immune? That caring about the truth would save you? That's not how real life works, I'm afraid. I swallowed, fear swelling like an ugly bubble inside of me. How does it happen? It starts as an ineffable feeling of loss, like you've misplaced something important. The emptiness grows inside you, and then invades your head, until it gnaws at your thoughts, tainting everything good with poisonous doubt. Eventually, the yawning nothingness within would be so complete, though you have not left to live for, and you'll end your life. So there's nothing I can do. She leaned forward and grasped my head in her strong, dirt-rimmed hands. You can do exactly what you were doing all along, but not for yourself. Tell your story. Write out your little electronic letter and send your creepy pasta all around the world. Tell people that this horror is true. I am real, and that if anyone comes near me, they will die. She let me go, the intensity fading from her eyes. Now leave me. I can't stand seeing yet another human die because of me. And so, I guess I got my wish. I hope you enjoyed my little story, because it's the last one I'll ever tell. I can already feel the void inside me, widening, growing, feeding. It's gray and it's cold, and it's deeper than space. I've tried as much as I can to stop it. Therapy, medication, immersing myself in Disneyly happy music, and distracting myself with books and films. But everything seems so hollow, so trite, and so utterly pointless now. Nothing feels real anymore. I'm not exactly sure how I'll do it, but I think that somewhere in my old things from my childhood, there might be a pink plastic skipping rope. Yes, that seems real. That feels right and true.